Well, let's open our Bibles this morning to Mark chapter 6, verse 30 as we continue in this gospel written by a young man that Peter had led to the Lord and then had really recounted to him the ministry of Jesus. Mark was just a young man when the Lord died, but he was given the job of writing a gospel that focused on the servanthood of Christ, to be our example. And so there's not a lot of sermons in here, but there's lots of action, lots of miracles, lots of doing as the Lord is set before us, tirelessly investing himself in reaching out to anyone who will listen, no matter the cost, no matter the time, no matter how much time it took. Great example for us that now want to serve him in this generation. A couple of weeks ago, back in verse 7, the Lord had sent the boys out 2 by 2. It is the second year of his public ministry. They had been watching and listening and learning for quite some time. This is their first opportunity to go and do. And it's their first hands-on experience. God gave to them his power, instructions, and they went out kind of learning to serve down through verse 13. But then as a result of that ministry, if Jesus wasn't popular enough, these boys running into all these various towns made him even more so. And so Mark stops to kind of tell us the effect that the ministry of Jesus had, not only in bringing the crowds even more to him, but in particular on one man who had the rulership of the Galilee-Perean area, a guy named Herod Antipas. And in verse 14 down through verse 29, we looked last week at God's work in the conscience. Herod had, for a while, when he had locked John up because John had spoken about the illicit relationship he had with his stepbrother's wife, or his half-brother's wife, was put in prison to keep her quiet. But Herod loved listening to John, and it does seem for a time that he was pretty close to getting right with God. But mom wouldn't let that go. The woman just hated John and looked for opportunity. Finally, on the birthday of Herod, whom he had thrown, she sent her daughter in to dance kind of lustfully. Herod made a promise for half his kingdom, which he really didn't have. And she demanded, by her mother's, prodding, John the Baptist's head on a platter. And rather than doing the right thing, Herod did the wrong thing, kept his buddies happy, immediately took John's head off his shoulders, delivered it to the girl who gave it to her mother. And then we looked at how far your conscience will let you go, and eventually that your conscience dies. In fact, a year from now, Herod will have Jesus standing in front of him, but no longer convicted, no longer interested in sin or righteousness or forgiveness. He's now interested in seeing Jesus do a trick of some kind. And the Lord not only refuses, doesn't say a word to him. And we find Jesus walking away from Herod with nothing to say, and Herod having nothing and seeing nothing in him. Well, this morning we come back to the boys who we've kind of left go in verse 13. And down from verse 30 down through verse 44, the Lord is going to now meet with them after they return. And he wants to debrief them. He wants to continue to teach them. The lesson that we're going to learn this morning is an interesting one, because you would think that after spending however much time they were out ministering, that they would have learned that their strength lie in him. Nobody could heal the sick and open the eyes of the blind or cast demons out except the Lord be with him. And yet now they return and they seem to forget the entire lesson of who their strength is and where their strength lie. This is the message, by the way, I got saved at years ago. So this is one of my favorite Bible stories, as you might imagine. Verse 30 says this: Then the apostles gathered to Jesus, and they told him all the things, both of what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, well, then come aside by yourself to a deserted place and rest for a while. And so there were many coming and going, and they didn't even so much as have time to eat. And they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. Don't know how long the boys were running around, weeks or months. We have no idea. In fact, there is no information in the Gospels as to what they said when they got back or what they learned. We do know from Luke chapter 10 that when the 70 went out sometime later, they did have a lot of discussion about Jesus, and they even said, well, in your name, even the demons are subject to us. And they came back pretty impressed with God's power upon their lives. But for these guys, we don't know. We do know that they were gone long enough to cause the crowds to be even bigger, if that was possible. And notice in verse 31, now folks were actually coming and going and following after these men who had been in their towns ministering in the name of Jesus, and there was really no place to so much as rest, overwhelming, no time to eat. This is, I think, the third time Mark mentions how busy the Lord and his guys were. Mark says, here's a servant. Jesus sometimes couldn't find time to eat because he was ministering to others. pretty good lesson for us as well. Church life can certainly be busy. I remember hearing a little poem one time when I first started pastoring, and it went like this: Mary had a little lamb 'twas given her to keep, but then it joined a local church and died for lack of sleep. And sometimes it does get that way. I watched these poor moms and dads serving at VBS this week. It was hot, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of kids, but man, they were so faithful. And it's just awesome to see, but you do need a break sometime. And the Lord said, come aside before you fall apart, right? And he pulled them aside, and I'm sure that they were just thrilled to get some rest. They'd been going at it day in and day out. There's a great verse in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 15, that says the disciples addicted themselves to the work of the ministry. The word is devoted, I think, in the New King James. But it really speaks about the devotion that God would certainly have us as a church to make to the work of getting his name out there before anyone. Well, from Capernaum, where Jesus was, he got the 12 on the boat, and they headed northeast to Bethsaida. Bethsaida is kind of today, if you look at a map, where the Jordan River comes into the Galilee, Sea of Galilee from the north. It's called the Lower Golan Heights today, but it's kind of the more deserted part of the lake in the north. We read in verse 33 that the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from the cities, and they arrived before them and came together to him. And when Jesus when he came out, he saw this great multitude. He was moved with compassion for them. They were like sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. So the crowds weren't so dumb. They saw the Lord get in a boat. If you go from Capernaum to Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, it's about 4 miles. If you have to walk around, it's about 8. But they walked around quicker than he could sail over there, so by the time they landed, there were 5,000 men plus women and children, maybe 15,000 people waiting on the shore. Can you imagine? A great multitude is what we read in verse 34. And I, it doesn't say it, but I have to believe that the disciples were not too thrilled. They've been at this for a long time, and they needed a day off in the worst way. We need some R&R. Can you just get rid of these folks? Oh, my gosh. They never stop. We can't eat. The schedule has been hectic. They had just returned from a ministry trip. In their hearts, they were saying, great. This is just great. But look at the Lord's response. Verse 34 tells us that he had an entirely different view of things. To him, these 15,000 people were no bother at all. They were absolutely not an issue to him. No trouble. They were needy. They were sheep. They needed a shepherd to lead them and to love them. He wanted to be that shepherd, to get to these who were wandering in the wilderness and give them some direction. To him, that was his priority. Make sure these folks knew who he was. The apostles would have to learn, like we have to learn, about the love and compassion of God, because so often we are willing to serve as long as it's convenient. But man, the minute it impedes on my time and plans, let someone else handle it. And Jesus wouldn't do that. Now understand from even what the Lord's discussion will be with them on the next day. John covers the next day, chapter 6. That most of the folks in this big group of people were not there because they wanted their sins forgiven, or they were convicted of them, or they saw Jesus as the Messiah. They were there because he did cool stuff, and sometimes he fed us, and we got like free meals, sandwiches, great sandwiches. So even though they weren't there necessarily with the right heart or even with the right expectations, the Lord just served them anyway. Didn't question their motives as much as just loved them for who they were. He still met their need. In fact, the operative word in verse 34 was that he was moved with compassion. And it's an interesting Greek word. It's used 9 different times of Jesus when he stands before the poor and for the needy and before the sick and before the lost. It's a word that means to feel a concern in the pit of your stomach. When you see something that just, it just kind of hits you right in the gut. It's like it takes your breath away. And the Lord saw these people gathered. The disciples went, great. And the Lord went, they need a shepherd. They need someone to love them and to care for them. And in the pit of his stomach, the Lord was moved. It's a felt concern. Now let me ask you something. If you're in the midst of a busy place and everywhere around you are people that are lost and you're saved, what do you feel? How does that move you? Does it matter to you? Or is it just, hey, get out of my way, man, I'm saved. I'm going to heaven, I don't know about you. Jesus couldn't just walk away from needy folks without compassion that just moved his feeling. Certainly the way God should move us when we realize people around us are headed for judgment, when there's a Savior who can save them. He saw them as sheep without a shepherd. There are few animals as dependent as sheep. In fact, if you're easily offended, this might offend you that God would call you a sheep. Because sheep are certainly one of the dumbest animals on the planet. They will walk off a cliff. Ah! And the next guy goes, that looks like fun. There he would go. They will literally baa at a wolf. They won't hide. They'll, hey, how you doing? They will lay down and die for hunger when 20 feet away is a field filled with food. They are dumb animals. And the Lord says to you and I, sheep. But spiritually, that's true. We are lost without his help. We have not a clue as to how we're going to get out of the situations we find ourselves in. And so the Lord looked upon the people, and they needed care, and they were like sheep to him. And so he begins to teach them many things. Luke adds, and he began to heal those who needed healing. He began to minister to them. And the apostles, for whatever reason, I don't know how they felt, but more training was to follow. Jesus would have them serve when it is imposing, when it's inconvenient, when it's sacrificial, whenever there was a need. They would soon be asked, in fact, to identify where their strength lay, and they would lose this lesson. They would miss this answer. You've probably noticed that people will always serve when it's convenient, but when it's an imposition, it can be difficult. When's the last time, before you ran out to your car to head for lunch or whatever it is you're doing, you looked around the sanctuary to see if anyone was just standing by themselves? Maybe needed someone to pray for them. Maybe just needed a word or two from you before you went home. When was the last time you did that? Or are you so self-absorbed that all you can do is talk to your 3 friends, hit the door before the crowds back up the parking lot and I'm 5 minutes late for lunch? Jesus moved with compassion for the people that were needy. Church should not be a self-service plan. Well, we are told in verse 35 that the Lord ministered all day. When the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him. They said, this is a deserted place. It's already late. Send them away. They can go into the surrounding country and villages, buy themselves bread. They've got nothing to eat. We know from John that it was Passover time, so it was springtime. He will tell them to sit down on the green grass down in verse 39. So it was April. It gets dark at maybe 5:30, maybe 3 or 4 o'clock. The disciples thought they were doing Jesus a real favor. It'd be a good time to move these guys away now and along. There's lots of places to go, but they're not close by. And I don't doubt that the disciples thought that Jesus would go, hey, way to think ahead, guys. High five, Peter. Good answer, buddy. Way to look out for the crowds. That they were astute. You should know that the disciples, one of their favorite responses to Jesus was, send them away. Sound like us more than like the Lord? And when that Canaanite woman there in Matthew came because her daughter was severely demon-possessed, the disciples said to Jesus, Matthew 15:23, send them away. Or send her away. She keeps crying after us. She's bugging us, Lord. If you could just get rid of her, that'd be great. Thank you, in Jesus' name. When the little kids get brought to Jesus to be prayed for and blessed by their moms, it is the disciples there in Luke 18 who just tried to rebuke them. Leave the Lord alone, man. Get your snotty kid out of here. And the Lord went, hey, disciples, knuckleheads. Original Greek, knuckleheads. And here again, just send them away. And Jesus said in verse 37, you give them something to eat. Why don't you feed them? It's an emphatic term. Now, a couple of things you should know, because this is covered in all of the Gospels. Initially, Jesus spoke to Philip, and he spoke to him early in the day. Didn't just spring it on him at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when it was getting dark. He said to him early, Philip, where are we going to get food to feed all these folks? And it was almost like a challenge. Now, here you'll read the words, he said, and then they said to him. Notice in the verse 37 in the middle, they said to him. So Philip got the challenge because Philip lived 9 miles away in Bethsaida. He knew the area. But he went to all of the disciples who now put their heads together, got in a huddle, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon came up with this solution: Lord, get rid of them before it gets dark. It's pretty much how this whole thing kind of flowed, right? And we are told in John chapter 6, verse 6, that this was a test, meaning that the Lord knew what he was going to do. But look, these guys had just gotten back from an extended ministry trip. Hopefully they'd learned something. So here's a test for you. Here's 15,000 people. We're in the middle of nowhere. How are we going to feed them? Where are you going to get food for them? Let's take care of them. And they all went, yeah, we'll get back to you. And they did. They get back to them. Yeah, get rid of them. Now, this is the only place in the Gospels that Jesus asks his disciples for advice, because it was a training thing. And again, you have to go back to John 6 to read this. But it does make a couple of things clear to me. Number one, when God teaches you something, he expects you to learn it and use it. These guys had come back having knowledge of God and a relationship with him and his power that should have set them apart in their understanding of things. And he knows what he's going to do, but he hopes that you'll come to that conclusion as well. And they didn't. They didn't trust him more. They didn't say, Lord, there's 15,000 people here. You better show us how we're going to feed them, because I know you can. We're really not good at this. Look, Jesus could have flown in a manna drop, couldn't he? I mean, 40 years, 3 million people in the middle of nowhere, they were feeling just fine. The Lord could have called one in, but that wasn't what he was into. He wants to develop the relationship of these men to him so that their faith is made strong. Disciples have to become apostles. If you read back where we started there, verse 30, it says the apostles gathered to Jesus. It's the first time they're called apostles in the book of Mark. And the reason is apostles, by definition, are ones who've been sent out, right? Disciples, mathetes, means to learn, take notes, study guides, fill your mind with information. But the apostles take what they've learned and they go forward. So here are these disciples now sent out as apostles in the generic sense, doing the work of God, and now they come back, and the Lord said, we got to feed all these folks, and they went, yeah, I don't know. And they go right back to not being the sent ones again. Look, if you stop at learning, if you sit in church every Sunday and take notes, you'll be the most unfruitful person around. If it doesn't translate into going, I have found over the years that the people who sit in church with the most information but do nothing are the most troublemaking persons in the church. Oh, their head is filled with information so they can criticize you and gossip about you and talk about you, and things aren't going right and this isn't the way it should be, because that's now their ministry. They don't do anything except fill their heads and then fill their mouths. They're troublemakers. If you get to doing, you ain't got time for trouble. Over here, we got to feed this person. This folks in the hospital. This person needs prayer. I got to go and serve over. You're too busy. The apostles had been with Jesus for nearly 2 years. They'd virtually seen it all. It should be amazing to us that not one person said, hey, Lord, there's no way we can pull off 15,000 meals. What did you have in mind? It would have been just perfect to hear that come out of their mouth. But that's not what you hear. So Jesus talks to Philip. Philip goes and talks to his buddies. They come back with this reasoning. Besides, well, first they come back with a solution, send everybody home. Second of all, verse 37, here's their argument. They said to him, shall we go out and buy 200 denarii worth of bread so that we can give them all something to eat? Now, I know you gave us a job, Lord, but have you thought about how expensive this could be? We don't have this kind of money. A denarii was about the wages of one man's labor, average labor for 1 day, 1 day's pay. So Philip, and the answer is this, Lord, if we had 9 months worth of our salary, we couldn't give everyone just a bite of food, let alone feed them. There's no way we can pull this off. Now, I should tell you, that's exactly the conclusion the Lord would want them to come to. We can't do it. Excellent. So send them home. Oh, no. No. You were doing so well. Then you got so dumb. It's beyond us would have been great, but they stopped short of the obvious. Lord, when we were on the road ministering, it wasn't our provision, it was yours. People opened their homes. They took care of us. They fed us. We prayed. God, you moved. You're the solution. They didn't say Jesus can do it, but they had just gotten back from the Jesus Can Do It inaugural tour. They had T-shirts and everything. Now they're immediately overwhelmed by circumstances that their small trust and faith in Jesus, it wouldn't provide answers. It's kind of like, the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. They see so much, and every time they just immediately forget what God has done, and they go back to step one. Sound like you and I? God does something so great in our lives on a Tuesday, and by Friday we're going, I don't know what we're going to do. Financial difficulty, marital disagreement, parental difficulty, job loss, hurt feelings. I don't know what we're going to do. As if somehow God went, well, I work on Tuesdays, and then I take the month off. Rather than simple faith, and with all the recent events to encourage them, they could have talked to the Lord about it, but instead they engage in some mental arithmetic to show their wisdom and to reveal their ignorance. They were calculating without Jesus. That's not good. You don't want to calculate without Jesus. They'd sunk to a new low of common sense. They factored in every possible variable. It's too expensive. The people are too far away from the city. Send them home now. We're just running out of time. Send them away. They had figured it all out, except the one thing they hadn't done is they hadn't said, Jesus. And yet they had experienced and relied upon his power each day to preach and to go forward and to whatever. Now let me give you a little clue for those of you that are Bible students and that like things that maybe you wouldn't normally look at. I'm not going to go over it today, but the number 200 in the Bible, when it's used in the sense of an example as it is here, is always used to point out inadequacy, which is interesting, man's inadequacy. So if you go to Achan in chapter 7 of Joshua, or you go look at Absalom in 2 Samuel 14, or if you look at that apostate prophet Micah in Mount Ephraim in Judges 17, or the armies that are gathered together in Revelation 9, you'll find this 200 showing up to always speak about inadequacy. It's another lesson. I'm just throwing it out there because this is bonus material right there. All right, we'll go back to this now. Look, Jesus wants to bless you and I abundantly and to use us mightily, but it's going to require more than a figuring mind. It's going to require the willingness on our part to be faithful and available. Their answer shows the failure of human potential, but it doesn't consider Jesus at all. So verse 38, Jesus said, well, what do we have? Go see what we have. And they came back, and they said, we have 5 pitas and 2 smoked sardines. That was about it. They went scurrying to see what they had. And Andrew, we are told in the other gospel, was the fellow that found a boy with a very meager meal. 5 pita breads, little flat breads of barley, and 2 smoked sardines. By the way, barley is the cheapest of the grains. If you didn't have any money, you ate barley. If you had money, you fed barley to your animals, and you didn't eat it. So this was a cheap meal, not a happy meal, with 2 smoked sardines. And yet somehow Andrew, who is always in the Bible found bringing people to Jesus, was a pretty persuasive guy. He talked the kid out of his meal. We'd like to give that to Jesus, if that's all right. Okay, here, take it. And then Andrew said this as he brought it to the Lord, but what is this among so many? John 6:9. What is this? This really isn't enough either. So Andrew's arithmetic came up with not the cost, but the smallness of the provision. I don't have enough to meet the need. He'd forgotten what he'd been learning for weeks, that if you add Jesus to anything, you win. It's enough. It's plenty. He had left Jesus out of his figuring as well. There's that Psalm 78, verse 11, that says of the children of Israel, they forgot his works and all of the wonders that he'd shown them, and so they went back into the ways that they were used to. That's all it takes for us. Just forget what God has done, and you'll find yourself unable to do what he sets before you. Now, Jesus doesn't respond to Andrew at all. Just in Matthew says, just bring it to me. But I love the picture, and I can't wait to get to heaven to see the replay, because the whole thing's going to be on replay. The first million years, we're just going to watch your life and mine. It's going to be hilarious. The blooper reels will be great. But I see a bunch of guys standing in front of Niagara Falls with cups and going, I don't know where we're going to get any water. It's kind of the way you stand in front of Jesus, who has everything. And yet they didn't see it. So, look, don't be too hard on these guys. We kind of go through the same thing. But let me just say this to you. This lesson of taking what you learn and applying it in your present tense is not an easy lesson, nor does it come quickly, nor does it stay well. It does seem you have to really hammer yourself a lot to get to that point. So the boy hands his food over, and maybe he's the most faithful guy, you know? He hands the food over, he gives it to Jesus. It becomes the means by which the Lord feeds the thousands. The insufficient from the hands of the insignificant becomes both sufficient and significant if it first passes through Jesus' hands. And I guess that's the lesson you want to leave here with this morning. If you just give God what you have, regardless of how little it is, he can do great things with you. He used a young man with a slingshot and a couple of flat stones to slay a monster in Israel. He used a little maiden woman who was captured as a slave and dragged to a foreign country to reach a fellow named Naaman with the power of God at work in Israel, and a whole country heard, just because one little slave girl was willing to be faithful. He used a poor virgin girl in an obscure village to bring the Messiah into the world. God doesn't need much. The lie is that you say to him, I've got nothing. Because what you're saying then is you can't do anything with this. And he would say to you just the opposite. If you'll put it in his hands, which the boys weren't willing to do, then you can see God do great things. If you aren't willing to do that, you're left with it's too expensive, my provision is too small, my solution is just dump and bail and get away from the need altogether. They're bothersome, or they're sheep without a shepherd. To learn, I got this. To hear the Lord say, I got this. Big lesson for us to learn. So here's 10 or 15,000 people and 12 worried apostles and a cheap meal, and the Lord says, I got this. Verse 39 says that he commanded them to make them sit down in groups in the green grass, in groups of hundreds and fifties. And when he'd taken the 5 loaves and those 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves, giving them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them as well. And they all ate, and they were all filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments, full of fish. And those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. It's a good thing the Lord doesn't have the same attitude that the disciples had. But here's 12 guys that are now becoming ushers, decent and in order. Sit them down. Now, if there were 15,000 people, that's 150 groups of 100. That's a big restaurant to serve, right? Gordon Ramsay would flip out at this time, wouldn't he? And then there's Philip and Andrew and John and James, and they don't want to be here anyway. But the Lord takes this little meal, prays over it, looks up to the Father, and begins to hand it out. And then the boys are obligated to run up and down the hills passing out the food. And you know someone's yelling, hey, more food over here, more water over here, more bread over here. You just know that I'll be there in a minute. And they're just overwhelmed by the need, and they're having to serve. In our groups that we take to Israel, we have a night where we go eat out in the wilderness where Abraham would have raised his flocks, and we have tents set up, and you get food that Abraham would have eaten, served by people that are dressed up looking like Abraham and his buddies. But invariably, because we're sitting on the floor around these little tents, you know, and these little tables, people are yelling, hey, I could have some more bread over here. And you can kind of get the same feel for it, except just on a huge scale. I don't know what it did to their minds. You'd think, wow, now they've gotten it. But the Lord thanks the Father for the provision, and he hands it out to the disciples, who then hand it out to the people. And the miracle was all but hidden from the crowd. I mean, they may have seen it at some point, but it was the disciples who really saw it. They stood next to the Lord. There wasn't any fanfare, no flying angels, no shaking earth. This was a hidden miracle that these boys needed to learn themselves. And you have to believe, because most of the people were there to get something for nothing, that they didn't just eat, they ate, right? The word kortazo in Greek means to be stuffed. The word is glutted. I can't eat another bite. Everyone ate like that. They were stuffed. They were getting something for nothing. Just like the Lord to supply our needs and have way too much left over. And then they went back and they picked up what was left over. Verse 43, 12 baskets. The word is small baskets, but there are 12 baskets. And they carried them out, one each. God can do it. God can do it. God did this. A tangible lesson from Jesus. Chew on that for a while, Philip. What were you saying about needing more money? Hey, Andrew, you didn't think that was enough? Look at this, buddy. And then there's that little boy going home with 50 lunches. Dad wondered where he got them. Oh, you ain't going to believe this. How we need to learn that God whom we serve has resources far beyond what we have imagined. If we'll just give him what we have, it's enough. Look, Philip said too expensive, and Philip was right. And Andrew said not enough, and Andrew was absolutely right. And they were both absolutely wrong because they hadn't factored in Jesus. And you become painfully aware of your inadequacies when you set Jesus aside. Maybe the disciples came back a little filled with themselves from this trip. Maybe they needed to be kind of corrected. If you read in Luke 10 about the 70 that came back, they did come back saying, oh, Lord, even the demons are subject to us because of your name. And Jesus said, yeah, I saw Satan falling from heaven like lightning, but that's not why you should be so excited. You should be excited about this. Your name is written in heaven. So maybe they got caught up. Maybe this needed to be a corrective step. We don't know. There's no record of their discussion at all. But I'll tell you what, they had forgotten that the Lord could use them. And I would say to you, the idea to excuse yourself because you have too little and what you have isn't enough and the cost is too great is an excuse that only you make. Don't believe God ever says that about you. He doesn't. You give him what you have, he'll make of you what he wants. Just factor him into all the calculations, and you'll be sufficient for every good work with plenty left over. You know, when Paul asked the Lord to deliver him from that thorn in the flesh, it said he prayed 3 times, and the Lord said, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And Paul said, well, if that's the case, then I'm going to glory in my infirmities and in my difficulties and in my reproaches and in my needs, because when I'm weak, he's strong. In chapter 4 of 2 Corinthians, Paul wrote, we have this treasure in earthen vessels so that the excellency of that power may be of God, not of us. Don't you let yourself off the hook by saying you can't, I don't have what it takes. Oh, that's a lie. God isn't looking to you to somehow make up the lack. His eyes are going to and fro throughout the whole earth to see who's available. If you're available, God can do great things in your life. You say, well, the apostle certainly got it now. Well, no, look at verse 52. We'll end with this. We read these words, for they did not understand about the loaves because their heart was hardened. Hardened knuckleheads, same word. No, I don't know if that's true or not. Look, this is the only miracle beside the resurrection that's written in all 4 Gospels. It's here because it's one of the most important lessons that we can learn. It isn't what you have to offer that God uses. It's you, if you'll offer you. He'll use. Father, we thank you this morning for your faithfulness to your word, and how awesome is it to realize that we don't have to measure up to some standard or some potential before God. You will use our life, that you're just looking for the meek of heart and the humble and those who will make themselves available to you. That, Lord, it isn't our work, it's yours. It isn't our provision, it isn't our ideas. It isn't our schemes, it isn't our strengths or even our gifts for that matter. It is you that work in us and through us. And so for all of us that have been sitting for so long, excusing ourselves because of our lack of time or lack of ability, Father, change that. May we be out doing your work like Jesus did, day in and day out, when it's inconvenient, when it puts pressure on, when there's sacrifice involved. So easy to serve, it fits into our daily life. But what happens when we forsake all and follow you and leave home and family to serve you and put you before the comforts of this life? Father, teach us this lesson. And maybe that's the lesson for you this morning. God is willing to work. Are you willing to be available? Go to the meeting. Show up for the work. I've got nothing to offer. I don't know what I can do. That's good enough for him. He'll work, and he'll be glorified, and you'll be his vessel for honor. Maybe you don't know the Lord this morning. All starts in that same place. I can't save myself. I can't forgive myself. I can't get rid of this sin that requires death myself. Thank you, Lord, that you sent your son to die for me. And today I grab hold of him because what he did in my place brings life. And you can ask Jesus into your life this morning as you come up and talk to one of the pastors. And God will meet you here. Same way, being available. You've been sitting way too long. You know what happens when you sit too long? You waste your life and the work God would have you to do. I know one day standing before him, you're going to wish you'd spoken to more people and been available just a little bit more to be used by him. Well, don't regret it. Get busy. Follow Jesus' example there in Mark. Serve, and he'll enable. Shall we stand?